All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to take a look at what a biological species is. I'm sorry, bear with me. I want to get rid of this stuff on the display bar here if I can. Perfect. So we're looking at what a biological species is just after the activity that we did in class together. The first thing that you really need to know is off in the corner. So I want you to know that a species name is specific, or species names are specific. So you can't just say tree. You can't say, oh, well, that organism, it's a tree, because there's tons of different types of trees, but you have to be more specific. So let's say I'm walking in Rome down the Tiber River, and I see that there's a bunch of trees just along the walking path. Then instead of just calling them trees, I can refer to them as sycamore trees. So those are sycamore trees. So instead of just saying, oh, there are trees planted along the river, I can say, oh, there are sycamore trees planted along the river. And this way I'm just being more specific about the type of tree that I find. And most people would agree and call that type of tree a sycamore tree. So this is a common name. So most people in the same area agree upon a common name. However, we can even get more specific, so we can use the scientific species name as well to be as absolutely specific as we could possibly be. So we could say not just sycamore tree, but we could say, it's a Platanus occidentalis tree that is planted along the river. And then everyone would agree that that was the same type of tree. So it's the only organism that would have this specific scientific name. And actually, sometimes people disagree on the common names, so sycamore tree I don't think would get too much debate, but occasionally if you meet people from different regions of the world, they might have a slightly different tree that they would use the name sycamore for. So then going back to the main ideas of our activity, so we were trying to figure out what makes something a biological species. So we said that in order to be considered a species, several criteria must be met. Okay, so the first one was that they have to have a very similar DNA or very similar genes. We mean unbelievably similar, like almost all the DNA would be the same. So this is an example. So we're looking at us, human beings or people. The scientific name would be Homo sapiens. So if we picked a totally random stranger, and it could be someone that looked absolutely nothing like you, lived in a completely different area of the world, had different hair color, eye color, skin color, maybe their hair was very different, their ears looked different, they were very tall and maybe very thin, and maybe you're shorter and a little bit rounder, okay? So if we were comparing these two people, okay, total strangers look nothing alike, their DNA would be, on average, 99.5% the same. So that means your genetic code is a 99.5% identical. So that's extremely, extremely similar, and you are considered the same species. Okay, so it's the same species. We're both Homo sapiens. So on the other hand, we could take something that's considered a different species. So we could take you and a chimpanzee. So a chimpanzee is actually quite similar still to people in their genetic code. So you have 98% shared DNA. So if we looked at your DNA code and that of a chimpanzee, then the code would be 98% the same, okay, approximately, for everybody with any random chimpanzee. And we know that we are different species. So we are Homo sapiens, okay, and they're troglodytes. So that's a different species. And we know that. We look different. We do not reproduce together. We couldn't possibly reproduce together to get fertile offspring. We have no connection with them as far as social or communicative. So when we say similar, we really mean unbelievably similar. Okay, really, really, really similar. Because 98%, this just does not cut it. Okay, this is a different species. Okay, so it's super, super, super similar when we're talking about DNA. Then 2, we have to be able to produce fertile offspring with other individuals in order for us to be considered the same species. So if we look at humans, just as a silly example, okay, we know that as humans, you could reproduce potentially with others who are considered humans, and you could have children, okay, and then those children could have children. Okay, that's the idea. So that we're able to produce fertile offspring. So this would be you, significant other, this would be your baby who would eventually grow up and could potentially have their own child. Okay, so there's no innate reason why that would be impossible. Of course, we do know that people have fertility problems, but those are individualized problems, okay? It's not due to the fact that their parents were not the same species, right? So we know that humans in general can reproduce. Okay? They can have fertile offspring, and this is how genes are passed on for many, many generations. So we're the same species. On the other hand, there are situations in which organisms could mate and produce an offspring, but that offspring might be considered infertile. So we said in the case of the horse and the donkey, though they are quite similar, okay, similar enough to be able to reproduce and make a mule, they are not considered the same species. They are different species. And the reason is because the mule itself, so their baby, can almost never reproduce to make fertile offspring. So with no grandchildren or no ability to pass on the genes or the DNA, then they're not considered the same species. So here we're just reiterating with these words. So if the mule cannot have babies, then that means that the mule is sterile or infertile. And these two terms are synonymous, so they mean exactly the same thing. So it just means they can't have their own babies or offspring. Okay, last thing. The third one, the third one is important, okay, and it'll be specifically important when we look in this class to think about how people could potentially change environments and organisms' ability to encounter one another and reproduce. But 3 says that the organisms would have to be able to reproduce naturally within the wild. So that means that they would have to live in the same area, be able to find one another, and potentially be able to mate and create offspring. Okay. So then the question comes about is like, how do organisms become separate species? How do they get separated? So we're going to take a look at that together. And there's a few of these that could be potentially influenced by humans to start us out, and we'll talk about that as we go. So here we go. How do species become isolated or separate species? Well, sometimes we see that there's a mechanical difference between different organisms. So their parts or their bodies actually do not fit together to allow them to reproduce. So if they don't fit together, they're considered separate species. I'm going to erase some of this pencil mark because I think it looks messy. Okay. So if they cannot fit together, they cannot possibly reproduce together. That's a separate species. Next, their behavior. So if we look at this, okay, behavior just means that the way that one organism acts is unappealing or just not attractive to the other organism. So I liken this to two people. Maybe you're going out, you go to a dance, you might encounter someone who's clearly they're looking for someone else to spend some time with, okay? Maybe looking for a significant other. But just the way that they present themselves, maybe the way that they dress or the way that they dance or something, is not particularly attractive to you, okay? So you feel a little bit isolated by this behavior. And organisms are the same. So we were talking in one of the classes about fireflies, and even though fireflies are really similar, in their appearance, their behaviors can be different, so their patterns, so the way that they light up can be so different that even though maybe potentially they could mate with one another, they won't because they just don't find each other attractive. Then there's a habitat separation. So when we're talking about habitat separations, we're talking about organisms that still live in the same geographic zone. So maybe the organisms still live in the same forest, okay? So still live in the same forest. However, they occupy different zones of that forest. So I just drew some snakes here. And let's say the snakes live in the same zone, okay? They live, let's say, in Florida in the United States. However, one of the species likes to live in the tree canopies, so it slithers around up here and only meets snakes that live in this zone. And the other snake resides or lives on the forest floor. So that being the case, these two snakes are never going to find each other, even though they could be really, really physically living in close proximity. They're never going to find each other, and they're not going to reproduce. So they become isolated. So I used some human examples, so I'm sorry, but that's just kind of what I think about because it's kind of silly to think about. But geography. So let's say you live here in Italy. I don't know why, but you're living somewhere toward the south of Italy right now. And let's say you would get along really, really, really well with this other individual. Okay, it's a potential partner for you, a potential significant other, potential mate, but they live in Japan. Okay. You don't travel to Japan, you just stay around in Italy, and this is where you meet people, this is where you live. So you and this other person, even though potentially you could get along really well, potentially maybe you could reproduce, so there's no mechanical reason why that couldn't happen, you are just geographically separated. So you're never going to meet one another if you're not in the same place. So you never meet. And this actually is something I'm going to ask you to star, because when we're looking at environmental sciences and environmental systems, humans have the ability to segment or fragment environmental systems such that it's hard for organisms to move from one area to another in order to reproduce within different groups or to reproduce within that population of organisms. So let's say it might be really, really hard if I'm trying to think of animals that I've seen out in the wild here. And really, I haven't seen that many animals out in the wild. So maybe I'll just make something up and you guys can help me think of something better later. But let's say there's a group of, gosh, I feel like the most main thing I've seen is rats, so I don't want to say rats. But let's say there's a group of, I'm sure are there deer? We'll just pretend. Say there's a group of deer here, and there's a group of deer living down here, okay? So deer are organisms, they kind of look, oh boy, you like my little stick figures, I'm sure. Short tails, long heads, kind of like my beautiful horse on the other page. But they've got antlers, okay? Here's antlers. Perfect. Well, almost looks like this one's wearing a skirt, but no big deal. Okay, so let's say there's a group of deer living north of a big city and a group of deer living south of a big city. But if in the middle, okay, we have, my location might be a little bit off. Okay. We have the city of Rome, and there's not a lot of open forest space between this area where the deer live and this other area where the deer live. It's going to be really, really hard for them to meet each other. And that's just something that humans can influence. So populations can change due to these, looking at my way I'm drawing this, and I don't like it so much. So humans can influence the way that deer and other organisms reproduce and the way that they pass on their genes by separating populations of organisms due to just development. So something to think about, okay? So we'll keep going. So we said geography, and then we said there was another issue that can come about, which was temporal or timing. So temporal or timing, even though the organisms might live in the same location, it just means that they're looking for mates at different times. So this would be maybe